In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about sampling, why we do it, how we do it, and kind of the things that we want to watch out for when we're doing it. So let's first start out with why we sample. Right? So basically, the population is the target group that we want information about. Right? So just everybody that we want information about. But we only have resources to kind of take a small group of those people. Right? So you can't really just ask everybody in the US the same question all the time. There is a census that goes out and that's asked of everybody in the US, but generally just for everyday things, that can't happen just because it's so costly. And so we have to take a sample. We have to take a small subset of that population in order to study them. Now, we want to be able to make conclusions about the entire population, though. We want to be able to take that sample, use information from that sample, and generalize to the whole population. But to do that, we need the sample to be representative of the population. Basically, the composition of the sample should be roughly similar to the population, and basically, any conclusions that you draw based on the sample should be able to be generalized to that population if you have a representative sample. So how do we do this? How do we get that random sample? So we'll kind of talk a little bit about some sampling methods. Right? So the simplest is the simple random sample. Basically, everybody has an equal chance of being selected. So basically, you just kind of think about everybody puts their names in a hat, and then you just kind of randomly draw names. Right? There's also a stratified sample. You split the population into different strata, then you randomly select within the strata. This is typically done when there are certain groups of people that you want to make sure that you get enough from, whereas simple random sample you might kind of miss some groups entirely just because it's just completely random. Everybody has an equal chance of being selected. But if you want to, for example, make sure that you have an equal number of males and females or something like that, then you might go with stratified sampling. Cluster sampling is kind of a different way of looking at it. It's instead of splitting into strata and you select some from each, you split the population into clusters, then take everybody within a few clusters. Basically, this is just if you want to kind of take that population, if you have clusters where they're all kind of roughly the same as the population, you can just take some of them and just use cluster sampling in that way and take that as your sample. Multi-stage sampling is when you kind of do multiple steps with these methods. So you, for example, split the population into clusters, then take random samples within the few random clusters. And so basically, instead of stratified, where we're taking some from every single strata, you're only taking some people from some of the strata or some of the clusters. Right, so this is kind of a visualization that shows how the sampling methods are done. So if you take all the dots as people, or just kind of your population in general, right? So that everybody within this box is the population, and the red dots are the people who were sampled. And so in simple random sampling, you're just taking random people from all over the population. Stratified sampling is, you take these different strata, and then you choose just here in this case 3 from each of the strata. And so, you're making sure you're getting 3 from each of these different 6 strata. Cluster sampling is kind of doing a similar process where you're grouping the people in the population, but you are only just taking everybody within some clusters. So cluster 3, 4, and 8 here. Multi-stage sampling is kind of like that combination where we take clusters 3, 4, and 8, but we only take a few from each of those clusters. All right, so there's all of these different methods of sampling, and you do have to watch out for possible sources of bias. One big one is convenience sampling, sampling in which only easily accessible people are sampled. And so, this example of asking friends and coworkers, that's easy one to avoid, but, convenience sampling comes up in a lot of places. So for example, if you're trying to interview students at University of Maryland, it might be tempting to just kind of, camp out at the student union, for example, and just ask people passing by. But that's a convenience sample, and you might miss some people, or you might have much a lower probability of sampling some people who don't really go to the student union that often. So you do have to be careful into falling into the trap of convenient sampling. And then there's also non-response bias. Basically, when responding to the survey is voluntary, only a small portion might respond. So the people who don't respond, they could just be different from the sample that was collected, even though they're part of the population. They'd be different from the sample that was collected in some, important way. And so this happens a lot in online surveys or in reviews that people leave on products. So for example, if you go on like Yelp or Amazon or whatever, sometimes you might see that there's a lot of 5-star and 1-star reviews. And this is because people only really post reviews when they have strong opinions. And so you're not really getting the kind of middle range as much. So basically, there's a lot of different sources of bias, and there's actually an entire study of where all of these different sources of biases and sources of error might come into play. And we'll only touch on a few here, but this is important to know when you're kind of taking these samples, when you're looking at studies, think about what the sources of biases might be, where the sources of error might be, and whether your population and your sample are representative.